Hello, everyone. We're so pleased that you've joined us today. I'm Sharon Tiknis, Executive Vice President with the Alford Group. I know many of you are familiar with the firm, but for those of you who are not, the Alford Group is a national full-service consulting firm specializing in the not-for-profit and social sectors. We have offices in Chicago, New York, and Seattle. We offer services across the country to organizational governance in strategic planning, fundraising, corporate partnership strategy, data analytics, and much more. We work with nonprofit organizations in all sectors and with corporations, associations, and private and community foundations. On behalf of our entire team here at the Alford Group, welcome to the third webinar in our guest speaker webinar series. This series will conclude at the end of the month. We've been covering a variety of topics in the philanthropic sector, and all the webinars are free and are posted on our website. I'll share more with you about that at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is titled How a Nonprofit Employee Embezzled $12 million over 4 years, Safeguarding Your Donors' Dollars and Trust. Our guest speaker is the incredibly wonderful Ivy Walker, sitting here beside me, CEO and co-founder of Helios Digital Learning. Helios Digital Learning is a leading voice on ethics and compliance. You will hear Ivy and her team use real stories told by real people to underscore important trends, insights, and research. Ivy is a startup and growth business executive whose background includes a wide range of entrepreneurial positions in both the for-profit and not-for-profit settings. She has served as president of a consumer health startup that successfully launched a health gamification platform, as the CEO of a global social venture that brought diagnostic medical imaging to developing countries, and CEO of a business accelerator for startup and high-growth companies. Ivy holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois. We're so very honored and delighted to have Ivy present with us today. Before I turn the webinar over to Ivy, just a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is approved for 1 CFRE credit point for those of you who are seeking certification or recertification. The webinar is being recorded, and we will have the recording available for you after the event along with the slides. Please look for an email later today with both of these, as well as a short survey asking for your important feedback. Everyone joining us is in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. We'll have time at the end of our presentation for questions. At any time during the webinar, you may type a question by simply clicking on the Q&A icon in the upper left corner of your screen. Hopefully you can see that Q&A icon. That will open a window, and there you can type your question. We'll answer as many questions as possible during our Q&A session at the end. And then lastly, we invite you to join us on Twitter throughout the webinar using our hashtag #NPOStrength. We will be live tweeting and invite you to join the conversation there as well. With that, let's get started. Ivy, we're eager to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'd like to thank the Alford Group for having me here to talk about this really important subject. For many of you, some of this information may be a first encounter. A lot of times we don't think about these topics unless we find ourselves somehow touching it and embroiled in a situation. From my own experience, Sharon mentioned that I have worked in both the for-profit and the not-for-profit world, having run 2 not-for-profits and having sat on the board of several not-for-profits. I can tell you firsthand that once you start to become aware of some of this information, you start to see how these things can happen and the unfortunate side effects that you can experience with donors. And so that's what we really want to be mindful of. I want to start first with a quote from Benjamin Franklin. It's one of my favorites. It takes many good deeds to build a reputation and only one bad one to lose it. Nowhere is this more true than with organizations that have limited resources, such as not-for-profits. So we see in the news these days so many scandals on a corporate level or with wealthy individuals who have lots of money to sort of spend and bring PR to bear on their behalf and help them with the situation. But smaller organizations and not-for-profits tend to not be able to do that. And even with the large organizations, because of budget constraints where donor dollars need to be spent on actual programs, it can be hard to recover from those kinds of situations. So just like individuals, organizations need to very carefully cultivate and protect their reputation. And we need to remember that in this day and age, a situation doesn't happen and then go away. It lives forever online, and donors will see it when they go look up your information. So let's talk a little bit about what kinds of issues specifically I'm addressing here. Whenever we hear about things like fraud, the first thing people tend to think about usually is money. That is probably the most common form of fraud that takes place in any organization. And as you see on your screen, I have a headline from a recent situation that took place at the Field Museum here in Chicago. Not-for-profit organizations are the second most frequent targets of what we call occupational fraud. It's when an employee uses their position to take advantage of the institution for which they work. And it doesn't just have to be money. It can be data. So as you see now on your screen, there's a headline about the Utah Food Bank. Imagine that your donor's information is stolen. It's very difficult to regain the trust of individuals once their data, their information has been stolen. And many of us are sort of thinking about this now with the whole Equifax breach, right? 143 million Americans, half the country, our social security numbers, birth dates, driver's license, all kinds of data now out there available on what's called the dark web for sale to anybody who's willing to pay the price. But it doesn't have to be that some unknown hacker broke into your system. What if an employee walked off with your donor database information and used it for whatever their purposes are? These are things we need to protect. But it's not just money and data. It can also be property. Imagine you've had donations come in, toys for children around the holidays, and workers take those things and sell them. Employees take those things and sell them. How easy do you think it'll be to get people to donate to you the next time? It doesn't have to just be money or data or property. There's also investment fraud. And typically when we see in not-for-profit organizations, when the organizations fall victim to investment fraud, it's because of someone that they knew who brought them into the situation. So it's not some unknown individual that they somehow got connected to. It's someone who had a relationship with the organization. So these are some of the issues that can arise for organizations that can be a misappropriation of donor dollars that can then be held against the organization for a very, very long time. So now, how often does this happen? Well, the Washington Post did a story not long ago where they just looked at a sampling of 990s filed by not-for-profits, and they found that 1,000 nonprofits had reported $500 million of loss as a result of occupational fraud. So it was embezzlement, it was theft of toys, it was all kinds of things. Think about that, 1,000 nonprofits, $500 million in a single year they reported. That is no small number by any stretch of the imagination. The largest of those losses was about $100 million, and the smallest of those losses was $250,000. $250,000 is a lot of money to lose. So you want to be mindful of things like this because they do happen, and they happen a lot more frequently than we would like to believe. So why are not-for-profit organizations so vulnerable? There are a couple reasons that this is the case. The first thing is that not-for-profit organizations are mission-driven. People are there because they have a passion for the particular topic, subject matter, area of service that the organization specializes in. And when we find ourselves in environments where we are mission-driven and passionate about it, we think everybody is there with the same purpose. And so the level of trust within not-for-profit organizations tends to be a lot higher than it is in other organizations. Oh, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Now, not-for-profit organizations are also susceptible to this kind of occupational fraud because of limited resources, because of limited expertise. There's also the issue of not having robust internal controls. And internal controls are just at the core verification processes, where you verify the security systems that you have, you verify identity of individuals that you're hiring. You'd be surprised at how often background checks are not conducted. You're verifying who has access to various different types of assets within the organization. So the individuals who engage in this kind of activity are what's known as trusted insiders. A trusted insider would be someone who has a reason to have access to your organization's assets. It can be an individual at any level. It can be an entry-level individual. It can be an executive. It can be an outside business advisor. We have, for the purposes of conducting our jobs, we have a need to have access to the assets of the organization for which we work. And a trusted insider has built up the requirements that, for the most part, meet the needs of that. So trusted insiders can be longtime employees or volunteers. They can be business advisors like accountants or lawyers or investment advisors. You'd be surprised at how often in my business we work with people who have crossed the line. You'd be surprised at how often they are business advisors who took advantage of their access to their clients' records, their clients' bank accounts, and they misappropriated that for their own benefit. A trusted insider can also be a board member. I've unfortunately seen examples of organizations where board members have either engaged in conflicts of interest that led to a misappropriation of the organization's assets, or have engaged in direct fraudulent activity that has led to that misappropriation of the organization's assets. So there are all kinds of scenarios in which this can come into play, and you, at whatever level you are in the organization, the more you are aware, the more you are empowered to help the organization to protect its reputation, protect those assets, and make sure that those assets are being used properly for the mission of the organization. So now let's look at a case study. So a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to work with Daniel Wyant. And as I just mentioned, in my business, I spend quite a bit of time with individuals who have crossed the line, who have committed white-collar crime. And I do that because I like to take their stories and use them as teachable moments. Daniel Wyant actually came to my firm through my business partner, who is a white-collar crime specialist. He was a referral because she's kind of become known on the circuit as the go-to person when you commit a white-collar crime. If you'd like to explain yourself, you can talk to her, and we try to see if there's value in the story. We will use it to help other people to improve their organizational controls or to improve their decision-making so they don't go down that path. So Mr. Wyant embezzled quite a bit of money from the American Cancer Society of Ohio over a number of years, and no one noticed. And that's another thing that is surprising. Often in these cases, people don't notice what's going on. Daniel was the epitome of the trusted insider, and he also was the person you'd least expect would engage in this kind of activity. And we're going to hear a couple of video clips with Daniel explaining himself, why he did what he did, how he did it. And the reason I want you to hear this is so that, one, you can see just how normal Daniel and other people who find themselves in these positions are. And two, when we start to talk about tips for protecting your donors' dollars, he'll give you some insight into some of the things that allowed him to engage in what he did. So let's look at the first clip.
My name is Daniel Wyant. I started at one position and kind of progressed through the organization, and after a lot of times after you're brought into an organization, you may come in at a lower level, and the progression doesn't require, because people know you at that point, and they've decided that you're trustworthy. So that progression through the organization is usually a dangerous point that most employers overlook. But I did a very good job for them, and was promoted to the director of information systems, and then the vice president for information systems, and then took on more responsibility beyond IT. Was involved, took on the accounting department, strategic planning, and centralized procurement, all that kind of stuff. We took on a large project that had to do with implementing project management across the organization. That was very successful. And then, we centralized the banking and the investment portfolio, and came up with some innovative processes for processing donations and data management, that kind of stuff. So that's when I took on the role of chief administrative officer. I was a pretty young man at that point. I was 35 years old, so 34. So it was a pretty big advancement for a guy my age. I think that my career's kind of been like that. I had director level responsibilities in my 20s when I worked for the distribution company in Hawaii. So I've been very successful starting at a young age.
So Daniel, that's fine.
Okay.
So Daniel is an interesting case study. Daniel was very successful very early in his life, and he had a knack for building trust because he was a hard worker. He would go into the organizations and figure out what needed to be done, and he would do it. That's the kind of employee we all want. That's the kind of person we want to work with. That kind of person sets the example. And so that's the kind of person you least expect to do something that would cross the line, certainly something that would harm the organization. It's not something you would expect. So as you think about Daniel coming in, entry-level position, working hard, working his way up within 3 or 4 years to chief administrative officer of an organization, I believe they had an $80 million budget, an organization that was pretty well established and worked across a tri-state region. There were, or should have been, a lot of checks and balances that Daniel sort of progressed through in order to get from that entry-level IT job to the CAO role. But as he mentioned, one of the point of weaknesses often is that internal progression, because you've already been pre-vetted in a sense. You were pre-vetted for that original role, not necessarily for the role that requires access to the organization's assets and the way he gained access to them. So how did Daniel manage to siphon off so much money from the Cancer Society in 4 years? Well, he gave you a hint in that last clip, but we'll talk about that in a second. So I'll just hit some of these points really quickly. Daniel started in an entry-level position, as he mentioned. He added a lot of value to the organization. And here's a really key point. Daniel had knowledge of some of the organization's underbelly. And I mean that in 2 ways. I mean that in the one sense, Daniel knew what the weaknesses were, but Daniel also knew some of the challenges with the way the organization was run. And that will factor into Daniel's story a little bit later on. So now we're going to listen to Daniel talk about how he managed to pull this off.
Our investment portfolio was in the $16 million range. And one of the things that was strikingly alarming, I think, is the way that they controlled the investment portfolio. That's ultimately what the biggest problem was, is that I was able to order the movement of money between investment account into our cash accounts that would allow me to then transfer money out of the country. That couldn't be done from the investment portfolio. So the money had to be liquidated from the bond accounts, in other words, to be put into the cash accounts so that they'd be accessible to move offshore. So that process was pretty, once the relationships had been formed with the bankers, even though I wasn't the only one that was supposed to be required, it was pretty easy to have the bankers move that money around. So I think that was a major problem.
So Daniel built trust with the organization's outside advisors, the bankers. This is very common for someone in a CAO role. One of the things Daniel mentioned is that even though he wasn't the only one who was needed in order to make the movements of funds he was able to do, they still allowed him to do it. Also something that you see because people trust you. Why would he do anything wrong? He's the CAO. We've known him for several years. He's worked his way up through the organization. Yeah, 2 signatures are required on this, but we know him, so we'll let this go through. As you think about your role in the organization, think a little bit about how often you bypass a process that is in place because it's not efficient, or because you feel you've already vetted or know an individual, and so it's okay, this particular rule or policy doesn't necessarily need to be applied to them. It's something that we frequently do for lots of reasons. And so that is actually what enables this kind of behavior to take place. So we've got Daniel building these trusted relationships with partners, and Daniel identifying the weaknesses, meaning he knows he doesn't need multiple signatures. He knows he can do this on his own because he talks to the people who are involved in this. So Daniel moves a ton of money offshore, money that belongs to the Cancer Society, money that came from donors, money that's designated for programs. That sounds like that shouldn't be such an easy thing to do, right? We're talking millions of dollars moved offshore. Let's hear what Daniel has to say about that.
It was very easy. I think that it required a lot of ingenuity and time to build the relationships and to have the trust developed. And it's important to understand that. I mean, I didn't, just like any of these situations, I didn't enter into the opportunity to steal money. For me, it's always been a lot more complicated than that. I feel like I have always had the best of intentions and always been very successful, and always started with no compunction at all that I would steal money. It's one of these things when you get to a certain level of responsibility and success. For me, it's always kind of developed into a self-destructive type of thing where you just have an underlying sense that you're not good enough and that you're not going to ever make the best impression. And that kind of leads me to the point where I'm looking for other ways to enrich my life. So it's, I think the common thought is that, a confidence person like myself would always be looking for the opportunity to steal, and that's just not the case. It was the opportunity presented itself, and the inability to make the right decision in that moment, and then getting caught up in a circle of okay, you're doing this now. It's you've taken the shortcut. You've put yourself into a situation where you're all in, and then just having that grow and spiral until something happens to stop it.
So Daniel mentions that he didn't start out with the intention to commit fraud. That's oftentimes the case. Most people don't wake up and say, I think I'm going to go out and take something that doesn't belong to me today. Most people believe that they are good people. And for the most part, they are. But all of us, under the right set of circumstances, can make bad decisions. All of us have pressures that, if applied in a very specific way, a very specific manner, can lead us to rationalize why something we are doing or something we want to do isn't wrong. Rationalization is one of the tricks of the human mind. It's one of the things that we as human beings are best at, whether it's rationalizing something that is fraud, or it's rationalizing why we should eat food that we know isn't healthy for us, or why we should work longer hours or work fewer hours. It's one of the things that we do best. With Daniel, as with all of us, internal personal issues pave the way to those decisions that we make. And so it's important to be mindful of this as you think about your role in the organization. What might pave the way for those around you who you know have access to donor dollars or assets that are coming in from donors, such as toys that are to be used for children? What might be some of the triggers in your particular environment? And we'll talk about red flags a little bit later. I'm going to play one last clip from Daniel, and it will be Daniel talking about how he rationalized what he did. And I think this is really important for us to understand.
It certainly crossed my mind that, that what could happen to my family and to me. I was, fully aware of what the consequences might be. I don't think that what happened to the Cancer Society ever entered my mind, to be honest with you. It should have. I knew that the organization was insured. I knew that it wouldn't cost, ultimately cost the Cancer Society any money. And I also had a sense that they weren't. Some of the guilt in damaging the organization was kind of tempered by my feeling that the organization wasn't really upfront and straightforward with their constituents. So I kind of felt like they were, in a sense, taking from the people that were giving money and not necessarily being efficient with it or being straightforward about how they were using it. So I kind of felt like that they deserved it, maybe even. They kind of had it coming to them. It was just a general sense that they were willing to kind of manipulate representation of finances in a way that it would be in a better light. For instance, I was asked at one point by a supervisor to manipulate the accounting of our revenue in a way that would allow us to keep our percentage of donations allocated to general administration below 25%, which was kind of the cutoff point for a not-for-profit being evaluated as being effective or not. And it was never, an explicit, well, you should cook the books, but it was definitely, can we find ways to allocate enough expense? Because it was a very close, I think it was like 24 or 23% that we were at, or I'm sorry, 28 or 27%. So the idea was that could we allocate our expenses in a way that would get us under that so that we didn't raise any red flags with watchdogs. So I felt like things like that, and just the general sense that there wasn't a quick enough mobilization to do things that were efficient, and that they were wasteful with money, and some of the knowingly doing fundraising activities that didn't make as much money as others. Just left me with a sense of a little bit of cynicism, I think.
So notice what Daniel does there. First, he starts off with, I wasn't really hurting anyone, right? I knew they were insured. They get the money back. No big deal. Then he switched to, they deserved it. right? So on the one hand, you have, I'm not bad because I didn't hurt anyone. But then on the other hand, you have, I'm not bad because I just gave them back what they were giving out to begin with. And this is what I meant earlier when I said Daniel knew the underbelly of the organization. One of the things that you see with people who rationalize having done something wrong is they look for the everybody does it rationalization. And this is something you should be mindful of in your actions as a leader in your organization, because whether you know it or not, people interpret actions in a way that you may not intend them to interpret, but in a way that is beneficial to them rationalizing something or other that they want to do. Whether it's that person wants to sneak out early or have a long lunch and they say, wow, the chief development officer comes in late. Shouldn't be a big deal if I sneak out early every now and then. Or as Daniel says here, well, they wanted me to look at how we were allocating expenses, and so they weren't being fully honest, and so I didn't need to be fully honest either. So those are some of the things that we need to keep in mind as leaders in our organization. One of the reasons, among many reasons, but one of the reasons why as a leader, your own actions need to be above reproach. They need to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, because everybody's watching you, and your actions become the basis of the rationalizations that they use to justify what they do. Now, before I move on to the next step, which is protecting the organization, I want to talk about how this whole thing came undone, because it had a very ironic, interesting end to it. So Daniel moved all the money offshore and left the country. He left and went to Austria. When he got to Austria, he called his wife. Daniel had a wife and has a wife and 3 children. When he got to Austria, he called his wife and he asked his wife to join him, to pack up the kids and join him in Austria. Now, his wife knew nothing of what was going on. And obviously, this was a bit odd for her to receive a call from him in Austria saying, I'm not coming back, why don't you come join me? So his wife called a friend of hers, whose husband was married to an FBI agent. And she was directed to file a police report. And she did, or she went to file a police report, but the police turned her away. Why did the police turn her away? Because the Cancer Society didn't know the money was missing and they hadn't filed a report. So there was nothing that the police could do. So she agreed to wear a wire, recording conversations with Daniel over the next couple of days as she pretended to be debating whether or not to pick up and move to Austria. And at this point, the money was still routing to the bank in Austria and had not become available yet for Daniel to access. And then she revealed to him that she wasn't coming and that she had been recording him and that she was turning him into the authorities. And she advised him to come home. And she told him that she would wait for him after he got out of prison if he surrendered. And Daniel surrendered. He came back to the country after deciding that a life on the lam was not a life for him and that the whole thing was dumb to have done anyway. He came back and he served time in prison for what he had done. So ultimately, he did something terribly wrong and realized after he got done doing it, it really wasn't what he thought it would be. I hear that actually a lot from people who do things after they've done them. It wasn't what I expected it would be, and they regret it. Because as I said earlier, most people don't wake up and decide that they're going to become a fraudster. It really is incompatible with who most of us are at our core, but we don't always know it until we've gone so far across that line. So now let's talk a little bit about protecting the organization. The first thing we need to think about are the red flags. There are lots of red flags, and we could spend a whole hour just talking about red flags. But I want to talk about a couple that I think you should pay attention to. The first is processes involving money or data, information, that are completely under the jurisdiction of one person. So they're responsible for every aspect of calculating donor receipts, depositing those donor receipts. They, they get it in, they put it in the bank, or so only one person owning the database and having access to the database. You would be surprised at how often a disgruntled employee will lock you out of your data. So that's one thing to be aware of. As much as possible, there should be cross-training on important processes that you oversee as well as across the organization. Behavior that is extreme in its territorial nature. People not sharing information, people wanting to completely be the go-to on any specific thing. That's a red flag as well. And then finally, if you've got somebody complaining about their working conditions, you might want to tune in and pay attention to that, because oftentimes that becomes the genesis for their rationalization, for why they are owed whatever it is they decide to take that doesn't belong to them. They're working too hard and not getting paid enough hours. Nobody else does as much work as they do. So-and-so is guilty of always doing X, Y, and Z, and why don't we all get a chance to do that, right? So you want to listen to people's complaints, decide whether or not there's something really there to them, address them if there is, and pay attention to what else might be going on there. So just a few tips at how to uncover and combat this. That's the first one, pay attention. You also want to evaluate your staff regularly. So Daniel mentioned that the entry point, he came at an entry-level position and was promoted up the chain pretty quickly. He wasn't reevaluated. As he said, his background was IT, and he ended up as the chief administrative officer over all kinds of things, and it was never really evaluated. He was never put through any sort of background check. So he went from a role where he wouldn't have any access to assets to a role where he had significant access to assets and had not been thoroughly checked in the background. And in this case with Daniel, had they done a background check, they would have seen that he served time in prison for embezzlement previously. So Daniel sort of mentions that he sort of gets into this position where he doesn't start out thinking he's going to steal money, but then he gets into a self-destructive kind of position because of his own self-esteem, and he ends up doing something like that. So had they looked at Daniel a little more closely, they would have seen that he was a risk. And even the bank should have done that. But, I personally think before you're added to the bank account of any organization, the bank should take a look at that, even if the organization hasn't. And I've chaired a number of nonprofit boards and have been added to bank accounts for that reason. And I always think the same thing every time. They should be vetting everybody.
Right.
Everybody. So pay attention to nonverbal cues and messages. So now what I mean by that is, Daniel said early on, he talked about how, he was asked by a supervisor to reallocate expenses, find a way to reallocate expenses. That's a message. Now, I don't know the situation. I have run nonprofits. I know we've looked at that, that overhead percentage and figured out, is that really the right number? Are we really allocating expenses appropriately? That's all. That may have been all that was. And Daniel used that as a way to justify what he was intending to do later on. But pay attention to the actions and the nonverbal cues that are being communicated throughout the organization, because again, those become the basis for rationalizations down the road. Every organization should implement and follow internal control processes. Now, many times there are internal control processes in place, but they are cumbersome. They are inefficient. They slow us down in our jobs. And so we shortcut them. And when you shortcut a process, you also short circuit that process as well. So there needs to be, from a leadership perspective, there needs to be a focus on making sure that processes and internal controls are followed. One of the things Daniel said during his interview was that they actually had these processes where you needed more than one person to sign off on them, but nobody was following it. Well, if nobody's following the internal control, it's useless. It's pointless to have it. And they actually convinced their board to allow them to ignore the multiple signature requirement because it was cumbersome. Well, that opens the door to exactly what you see here. And if your organization doesn't have one, you really need an ethics and compliance program. It doesn't need to be something that is monstrous. There's the old story or saying about video cameras and what we do when we think they're watching. Even a video camera that doesn't have film in it, doesn't have a tape in it, isn't connected, even that video camera gets people to change their behavior. Why? Because they think someone's watching. We're always on our best behavior if we think someone is watching. Now, as we know, the true sense of character is what you do when no one is watching. But that's a whole other webinar. You need to have some time that is spent on letting employees of the organization know, A, you have your mission and that's important, and B, the way we conduct ourselves as an organization, as an institution, as individuals within this organization and institution is also important. And sometimes that can be just as simple as having a refresher annually, a couple times a year on what the organization finds to be acceptable behavior, and reminding people that internal controls are in place and that somebody's monitoring those internal controls. So that is it for my presentation today. I wanted to leave some time for questions.
Great. Well, you know, Ivy, I think one of the things that we often hear in our consulting work with the Alpha Group, in speaking engagements and even with clients is, you know, we're a small organization and it's hard for small organizations to be upheld to what's considered best practices by nonprofit organizations, regardless of what element we might be speaking of or business practice within that organization. And one of the things that you mentioned is that nonprofits that don't have important systems and controls in place should find ethics and compliance programs. Are there tools that are out there that are available for people to look at to say, this is an example of at least the essential elements of the internal controls that a nonprofit should have?
Yes. So I recently did some volunteer work with a not-for-profit organization in Montana, where we, part of what I was doing for them was looking for a source, a free source that could provide them with the framework that they needed in order to implement their first ethics and compliance program. And we were able to find actually a number of resources were available for free from associations that provide best practices for not-for-profits that provided that information. So it is absolutely available.
Okay, good. So we ought to do our Google homework or whatever web browser we use. Can you share some other warning signals that something is wrong? I mean, you talked about people being secretive, people, you know, not allowing access to things, people complaining about their workspace. What might we see in addition to that that would be another red flag?
Someone who doesn't want to take vacation. Oftentimes, when someone is engaged in activity that they don't want to be discovered, they will just simply not take vacation because that's the best way to keep it hidden. So you want to make sure that people are taking vacation, and you want to pay attention to why people may not be taking vacation. So that's another red flag to look for.
That's good. Lucinda, I think you have another question here.
Yeah, I do. So we have questions coming in. If you want to ask a question, simply type it in the Q&A window, and we will get to as many as we can. This question is, how do you implement internal controls or communicate with employees about those controls without making staff think that you question their trust?
That is an absolutely excellent question. I have gotten this question many times, and I will tell you 100% of the time is from not-for-profit organizations. And it goes back to what I said before, which is we're there for the mission, and a sense of trust is really important. The first thing I want to say in response to that question is something that one of my for-profit clients who works for a financial services institution likes to say, and that is trust is not an internal control. And there is a respectable and respectful way to communicate to people that you are putting processes in place to protect them. Because at the end of the day, when you have internal controls in place, if someone makes a mistake, that process can then protect them and helping to make clear that there was no malintent in what happened. And so the controls protect both the organization and they protect the individuals in those roles. I would also say that one of the things I tell not-for-profits is that the focus needs to be on showing donors that you are being a good steward of the resources they're providing you. So in communicating with staff about why you need to have these things in place, the truth of the matter is donors really expect that. They assume they're in place. They really expect that they are in place. And as you elevate the operation of your organization, you want to make sure that you are meeting those donor expectations around being a good steward of their resources.
I wonder, in this day and age of cybersecurity, what do you see nonprofit organizations doing to try to protect their data? Or what are the, in finance, we know through the audit process that, they're presumably, an external auditor is verifying that funds are being used and applied as they're being reported to be. They're asking board members to sign conflict of interest forms to disclose any conflict of interest. What in the realm of cyber security should nonprofits be thinking about?
So I'm going to answer that question second because I want to hit something that you just said.
Okay.
I would like for everyone on the call to understand auditors are not looking for fraud, and auditors will not uncover fraud unless they have a reason to expressly look in a particular area of those organizations. I had involvement with a not-for-profit where we had auditors like everybody else, and they were doing their audit as usual, and the executive director called me one day and she said something to me that put a red flag in my mind, which is that the auditors were walking arm in arm down the hall with the CFO, and that the auditors had mentioned that they would get to her, the CEO, eventually and ask her a couple questions, but that they had everything they needed from the CFO. And that's just because of what I do, my antenna went up. And I also had known that the CFO was very protective of information, and I thought it was just because the CEO was new and he was sort of kind of getting a feel for her. But adding these two together, I decided maybe we should bring in somebody to audit the finance function, which is what we did. And guess what we found?
Wow.
Fraud. Wow. So auditors are not looking for fraud unless you specifically point them in that direction. Now to your question about cybersecurity. Nonprofits are not doing enough when it comes to protecting their data. Part of it is because it's a very challenging thing to do. I mean, just look at what's happening with big corporations that have lots of money to spend. You name it, Home Depot, Target, Equifax. Although Equifax use admin as the username and password, so if you're doing that, please don't. But there's not enough being done, and because you do have information about individuals, and sometimes depending on your organization, you might have information about individuals who really need their privacy. You want to be careful about it. There are organizations out there that are starting to put together best practices for nonprofits. The thing that you need to understand is that for the most part, the biggest issue with cybersecurity is internal, meaning your systems are hackable because of what people are doing inside the company.
Right.
They're not following basic practices. They're not using strong passwords. They're falling for phishing scams and things like that. So there are resources out there, but not enough is being done.
Yeah, and it seems that there are increasing incidents of employees sharing information with other sources, perhaps for personal gain or compensation in some fashion. So selling data, selling information.
And so you want to also make sure that people are accessing information for a reason. They have access for a reason, and not just because it's on the network and everybody in the organization can access it. So you do want to start thinking about having firewalls, Chinese firewalls, where only certain people are accessing certain information.
So for the people who are listening to us today and thinking about, so what should I do? What should the next thing I do after this webinar be, in asking whether it's my CEO or my chief development officer or whomever within my organization, what are the internal controls in our organization? Or are we sure that we have the right internal controls for what we do, and have we really looked at them in the 21st century, looking at the risks that are there? I mean, just going back to what's still shocking to me, over 1,000 nonprofit organizations in 1 year experienced over $500 million in embezzlement. I mean, we need to take this seriously in our organization.
Right, and so to your point, that the next step is really just to ask the question that you just asked, which is, what processes do we have in place? Start the dialogue, start the conversation within your organization about what is in place and how things are handled, and really keep the donor at the forefront, because a lot of times it's easy to brush this off and say, well, we don't have time, we don't have money, we don't have a problem, whatever it is, whatever we don't have. What you need to always keep in mind is donors really can be hard to win back if you've lost their trust. And once you have an incident within your organization, it's easy to find it online. So start the conversation around being good stewards of our donors' resources. What processes do we have in place that helps to ensure that we are protecting those resources?
And it seems to those who are listening who are members of boards, this is an important question to ask too. Again, not to assume that because we have an external auditor that we're uncovering potential for fraudulent behavior, but that this is a holistic concern that we should have, obviously, certainly around contributed revenue or any resources, but clearly whatever the assets of the firm are or the organization are. Even donated toys, deciding, well, these kids don't really need this toy and my kids would really like it, or I have a nephew or a niece who is not going to get toys for Christmas, so I'm going to take this and give it to somebody that I know has a need.
Everybody in the organization has a role to play in protecting these resources and protecting these assets, and it should really be put to the organization in that way. I'm working on a project for a client. We called it, internal controls, as vital to your role as your morning cup of coffee, because they have 9,000 employees, and all of them have a role to play in making sure that the assets of the organization are protected. So board members absolutely have a role to play. They need to know what questions to ask of management. Management has a role to play. They need to know what questions to ask of their advisors and of their staff. And staff has a role to play in understanding what those processes are. And the other thing is staff has the best knowledge of when processes are working and when they're not working. And so you need to have a two-way dialogue with staff about whatever processes you do have in place.
Right.
How do we improve them? How do we change them? Is this necessary?
Right. Is there like every 3 years you should update them, or every year you should look at them? How, looking at your internal controls, what's best practice in terms of making sure that your system is up to date?
So internal controls, that's a process. So it's not something you want to look at once. You do want to have touch points where you do a holistic evaluation of it. And that, evaluation should occur at least annually. But on a regular basis, someone needs to own the control and ensure that the control is being followed. Because again, if it requires 2 signatures in order to move money and one is getting it done, you have a control in place, but nobody's monitoring that it's actually being enforced. So somebody needs to own whatever that control is so that there's a monitor on a regular basis, making sure that it happens. But in terms of evaluating their effectiveness, at least once a year.
And whose role do you find is typically the internal control system oversight owned by?
It really depends on what the control is. Oftentimes we think of them as just being financial. If it's financial, then it's whoever is over the finances. But think about in terms of the donated toys again, right? There needs to be a control in place that the access is restricted. They're kept in a certain place, that only certain people have access to it. Well, who would own that control? It wouldn't be a finance person necessarily, right? It could be a program person. So it really depends on what the control is, what asset is being protected. So think about it that way. You need to protect an asset. What's the control in place to protect that asset? And then who owns that control as a natural sort of course of practice?
So development professionals who are listening, think about what the internal controls need to be for your department, and develop them perhaps with your team if you don't have them, or find them through the web, through different resources that are there, and share them broadly. I think at an all-staff meeting or an executive team meeting, and it's a way for you to demonstrate to your donors that you're being proactive in protecting their giving to your organization.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Ivy, we can't thank you enough. We're excited about having you and the others who have participated in our webinar series, and want to wrap up today to share just a little bit about the next webinar, which is coming up. On Thursday, October the 26th at 2 p.m., we'll cover the best practices and new strategies for donor recognition in the 21st century philanthropy, where we know times are changing, trends are changing, people are giving with different ideas about how they want to engage and be recognized by organizations. So you see here on the screen the information. You can just go to our website at alford.com and register. We hope you'll join us for that. And then just as we wrap up, please keep an eye out for an email later today from our firm, where we'll give you a link to the recorded presentation, and we hope you'll share it with others in your firm and ask them to join you in this quest to bring about strong thinking about how to ensure that you are protecting the assets, the resources, and the trust that people hold in your firm. There will be a very short survey that we would love for you to return so that we can learn how well we did and how we can do things better. And we thank you again for joining us, and this concludes our webinar today. We'll now disconnect.